The scorching sun burned the land of Rome like an unrelenting fire, casting its cruel light on the cross raised in the center of the square. The raw wood, stained by the sweat and blood of other condemned souls, awaited the body of yet another martyr. Timothy, the son of faith and faithful disciple of the Apostle Paul, stood there, marked by time and the scars of the mission he had embraced. His wrists, already wounded by the lashes, throbbed under the rough bindings that held them. But his soul, that remained free, unshakable. The murmuring of the crowd echoed around him like the roar of a turbulent sea. Some mocked, others merely watched, while the soldiers adjusted the nails that would soon pierce his flesh. Yet, the imminent pain was not his concern. Deep within, something stronger called to him, a journey through memory, a return to the past that had shaped him for this moment. Lystra. The memory emerged like a distant vision, clear and vivid. It was a simple town where trade filled the streets with voices and the scents of spices, and the hills around it witnessed the comings and goings of travelers. There, in the warmth of home, Timothy had grown up with the sacred words of the scriptures, taught with devotion by his mother, Eunice, and his grandmother, Lois. They were pious women, guardians of a faith that had nourished him since childhood. But there was also a silence at home, a gap that could not be filled by the knowledge of the laws of Moses. His father, a Greek with a heart closed to the faith of the Jews, had never shown interest in the promises of the God of Israel. Timothy felt torn between two worlds, one that spoke to him of eternal covenants and another that followed gods forged by the hands of men. The unrest within him grew like a flame, waiting for the right wind to ignite. Then came the news that reached Lystra like a wind before the storm. A Jewish man named Paul was preaching a new message, a truth that divided opinions and challenged deeply rooted beliefs. Moved by an impulse he did not understand, Timothy went to the crowd and slipped between the curious to listen. The words of that man carried a weight different from anything he had ever heard. He spoke of a crucified and resurrected Messiah, a king who did not wield a sword, but whose words broke invisible chains. Each phrase ignited something within him, as if he were rediscovering the very God he had grown up hearing about. But before he could fully understand, the commotion began. The city leaders were enraged, and the crowd turned against Paul. Stones were raised, insults hurled, and in a matter of minutes, the preacher lay on the ground, his body bruised and lifeless. Timothy stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. Was this the fate of those who followed this Christ? Fear threatened to suffocate him, but something within him resisted. The next morning, when the dust of the riot seemed to have settled, a murmur of astonishment spread through Lystra. Paul was not dead. As if defying the very sentence of his aggressors, he rose and returned to the city, with the marks of violence still visible, but with a firm gaze. Timothy saw in him something he could not ignore, a faith that did not bend before death, a certainty that transcended fear. In that instant, he knew his life would never be the same. The restlessness he had carried for years had found its answer. Timothy went to him, eager to learn, willing to follow. And thus began his journey, not just as a disciple, but as a man called to a destiny that would take him beyond the borders of his city, beyond the certainties of his childhood, to the heart of the gospel that would change his existence forever. Paul's return to Lystra was not just an act of courage, it was a sign. Timothy saw in it something the world could not comprehend. How could a man so marked by pain continue forward without hesitation? How could someone who had already faced death keep preaching without fear? The young man no longer needed answers. When Paul spoke again of the risen Christ, Timothy already knew his life was intertwined with this message. He approached the apostle, thirsty to understand more, to dive deeper into this faith that made men defy death. Paul, in turn, watched him attentively. There was something in Timothy, something beyond curiosity. It was a genuine thirst, a restlessness that was turning into purpose. And so, days later, when Paul and Silas were ready to depart, he made the invitation that would change everything. Come with us. Paul's call was not received without resistance. Eunice and Lois, though women of faith, felt the weight of the impending farewell. The young man they had raised, taught and protected, would leave for a world where beatings and persecutions were common, where imprisonment and death were probable outcomes. Timothy saw the concern in his mother's and grandmother's eyes, but he also saw trust. They knew he did not belong solely to Lystra. With tears and blessings, they entrusted him to the calling. On the morning of his departure, Timothy looked at his home one last time, engraving in his memory the paths of his childhood. But he did not hesitate. At Paul's and Silas's side, he took the first steps of a journey that would take him to the heart of the Gentile nations, where he would witness the glory and pain of the mission he had chosen. The days of travel were long, and soon Timothy realized that following Paul was not just a choice of faith, but a complete renunciation of comfort. The roads were harsh, covered in dust and dangerous, and the nights often spent in the open without guarantees of food or shelter. But none of this compared to the hostility they encountered in the cities. Wherever they went, their words divided hearts. Some received the message with joy, while others saw it as a threat. In every city there were opposers, men who reported them to the authorities or stirred up crowds against them. But what impressed Timothy the most was how Paul remained firm. The apostle seemed to carry an unquenchable fire inside him, a zeal that did not fade in the face of persecution. The young man, though often haunted by fear, decided to follow the example of his master. He would learn to trust, even when everything seemed uncertain. It was in Philippi that Timothy witnessed the definitive proof of the faith he now carried. After a series of sermons that provoked the anger of the local leaders, Paul and Silas were dragged before the authorities, beaten and thrown into a dark, foul-smelling prison. Timothy could do nothing but watch, his heart heavy with fear. But that night, something happened. Instead of lamentations or grumbling, a song was heard. From the deepest cell, the voices of Paul and Silas rose, singing praises to the Lord. That sound, in that darkness, was something that transcended human reason. And then, in response to the praises, the earth trembled. The chains were broken. The doors were opened. Timothy saw with his own eyes that faith was not just words, it was power, it was reality. When at dawn, the jailer fell at Paul's feet and surrendered to Christ, Timothy knew that this was the path he would never abandon. The time spent with Paul was shaping Timothy not only as a disciple, but as a leader in formation. His hands, once inexperienced, now handled the scriptures with conviction. His feet, once unsure, now traversed foreign cities without hesitation. Thus, it was no surprise when Paul, trusting in his young companion's growth, sent him to Berea to continue the missionary work. For the first time, Timothy was alone. The absence of Paul and Silas weighed on him, but the responsibility he carried urged him forward. In Berea, he found a different people, one that did not accept blindly what was taught. They checked the scriptures, examined each word, and reflected before believing. Timothy saw in this both a challenge and a blessing. He would need to be solid, grounded, but at the same time he had found hearts open to the truth. The church grew and strengthened under his teaching, but peace never lasted long. Paul's opponents in Thessalonica soon learned of the work Timothy was doing, and filled with envy and hatred, sent agitators to Berea to cause turmoil. The young missionary saw the danger growing around him, felt the weight of persecution bearing down on him. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be in the crosshairs of the world, to be the target of a blind rage that could not tolerate the truth. He could flee, he could hide, but he chose to stay. The courage he had learned from Paul now needed to be lived out. He continued teaching, strengthening the brothers, exhorting them to remain firm, even when everything seemed to crumble. It was in this moment that Timothy understood that spiritual leadership was not just about knowledge or zeal, but about being willing to suffer for what one believes in. He was no longer just a follower. Now he was a shepherd among the sheep, called to protect them at all costs. The news of the persecution in Thessalonica reached Paul, who feared for the fate of the new converts. The fledgling church was under relentless pressure, and the risk of apostasy was real. It was then that Timothy received a new mission: to return to the city, strengthen the brothers, and assure them that Christ was still Lord, even in the midst of the storm. Paul's order was clear, but the danger was even greater. Entering Thessalonica meant facing those who had incited riots against Paul. The young missionary, however, did not hesitate. His heart had already been forged in adversity, and he understood that a true servant of Christ does not choose the easy fields, but goes where the need is greater. Thus, crossing watched roads and streets full of hostile eyes, Timothy returned to the city that now needed him more than ever. The reunion with the brothers was marked by emotion and fear. But the church in Thessalonica was scared, pressed from all sides, but not destroyed. Timothy saw in their eyes something that reminded him of the very beginning of his journey, a faith tested by fire, but still burning. During his stay, he exhorted them, encouraged them, and strengthened them in the hope of Christ. He reminded them of Paul's words, of the sufferings that accompanied the gospel, but also of the glory reserved for those who persevered. When he left behind a strengthened church, a community that even in the face of persecution remained firm. His report brought relief to Paul's heart, who, inspired by the Thessalonians' testimony of resistance, wrote them a letter, consolidating the teachings and reaffirming that their faith had not been in vain. Timothy understood then that true victory was not in the absence of suffering, but in the unwavering perseverance through it. Over the years, Timothy ceased to be just a disciple and became one of the pillars of Paul's ministry. His name was mentioned in the letters to the churches. His presence was essential in the most difficult moments, and his faith was a rock upon which entire communities leaned. Paul knew he could not be everywhere, but Timothy was like his own eyes and hands, sent to resolve crises, strengthen the faithful, and fight the deceptions that tried to infiltrate among the brothers. In each city he passed through, Timothy saw not just the growth of the church, but also the increasing opposition of the world. He understood now, better than ever, that following Christ meant swimming against the current, facing the wrath of men, and many times being rejected by those he loved. However, his heart remained unshaken. He had learned from Paul that faith was not measured by circumstances, but by constancy in the midst of tribulations. It was then that came the greatest challenge of his life. Paul called him aside with a look that mixed seriousness and expectation. The church in Ephesus was in danger. False teachers had infiltrated, distorting the gospel and corrupting the flock. Strong leadership was needed, someone who could restore the truth and resist external pressures. Paul looked at Timothy and saw the answer in him. "Let no one despise your youth," he told him, as if already foreseeing the difficulties the young man would face. Timothy hesitated. He felt capable of teaching, but governing an entire church, confronting older men, combating false doctrines, guiding a people. The weight of responsibility nearly crushed him, but he knew he could not retreat. With an apprehensive heart but a willing soul, he accepted the mission. Ephesus was not just an ordinary city. It was a center of power, filled with temples, merchants, and pagan cults that dominated the lives of its inhabitants. The church that had been born there was growing, but it was under threat. False teachers were rising, distorting the doctrine, manipulating the faithful, and using faith for personal gain. Timothy arrived knowing that he would face not just a theological challenge, but a spiritual battle. With firmness, he began to correct the wrong teachings, restore the authority of the scriptures, and bring the flock back to the true gospel. He taught with patience, but without compromise. His commitment was not to the acceptance of men, but to the truth of Christ. Every sermon, every warning, every confrontation was an act of war against the darkness that tried to infiltrate the church. But resistance came, and it came strongly. The false teachers did not accept being exposed so easily. They questioned his authority, mocked his youth, and stirred up divisions within the congregation. Timothy felt the weight of loneliness. There were nights when he wondered if he was truly capable of continuing, but in his hands were Paul's letters, words that burned like embers in his heart. Fight the good fight of faith. Guard what has been entrusted to you. He knew his mission did not depend on his strength, but on his faithfulness to the one who had called him. So he remained firm. Those who tried to lead the flock astray were exposed, and the church, though shaken, remained standing. Timothy now understood that leading was not about having authority, but about being a servant, willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. The years passed, and the work in Ephesus grew. Timothy saw the gospel advance, but with it, the opposition grew. The Roman Empire was becoming more intolerant of the Christian faith, and the cities ruled by paganism saw the followers of Christ as a direct threat. In Ephesus, this was even more evident. The city was the heart of the worship of Artemis, the goddess revered by crowds. The temple dedicated to her was not just a place of worship, but the base of a lucrative trade, where idol sellers and amulet merchants grew rich by exploiting popular devotion. Timothy's preaching hurt this system. The more people turned to Christ, the more the idol trade weakened, and those who profited from this corrupted faith began to see him as an enemy. Murmurs began to arise in the alleys. Hateful looks became common. Timothy felt the storm brewing, but he did not falter. His commitment was to the truth, and he would not retreat. Then came the revolt. A group of merchants, led by influential men of the city, incited the population against Timothy. This man wants to destroy our goddess. He desecrates our temple. He wants to end the glory of Artemis. The crowd, consumed by fanaticism, filled the streets, shouting in fury. Timothy was dragged by force, pushed and struck as the mob surrounded him. The same streets where he had preached were now becoming his Calvary. Some Christians tried to intervene, but they were pushed away by the violence of the agitators. He knew this moment would come. Like his master Paul before him, he was now facing the hatred of a world that would not accept the truth. But he did not resist. He did not try to escape. Amid the blows, amid the voices calling for his death, he lifted his eyes to the sky, knowing that his life was in the hands of the God he served. The central square of Ephesus became a tribunal without judges, an altar of fury where the sentence had already been decreed. Timothy was thrown to the ground, his body already wounded by the stones that had been thrown at him along the way. The screams around him intensified, calling for his death as if he were a criminal, a traitor to the gods. The air smelled of sweat and dust. The sky seemed further away than ever, but his heart remained firm. In his mind, the words of Paul echoed, "If we die with him, we shall also live with him." There was no fear in his eyes, no despair. He had learned that suffering was part of the calling, that the cross was the path of those who followed the Master. While violent hands lifted him, preparing to strike the final blow, he opened his mouth one last time. "Repent and turn to the living God." His voice cut through the noise of the crowd, filled not with fear, but with authority. The brief moment of silence was followed by more fury, more blows, more brutality. But Timothy did not remain silent. Even in the agony, His final plea echoed through the square, penetrating some hearts, disturbing others. The blood stained the stones beneath his feet, and his vision began to blur. But in his spirit there was peace. He no longer saw the hatred of men, no longer felt the pain of the blows. Only one certainty filled his soul. His race was complete, his faith had been kept. The world might silence his voice, but the truth he had proclaimed would never be extinguished. The first blow was like thunder tearing through the silence of eternity. A stone hit his temple, opening a deep cut that turned his face red. Then more came, thrown with the force of hatred, smashing his flesh, breaking his bones. But Timothy did not scream. His knees gave way, his body staggered, but his spirit was no longer there. He looked beyond the crowd, beyond the pain, beyond the earth that was now consuming him. The dust rose around him, and the shouts of his tormentors mixed with the muffled roar of those watching in silence. To the eyes of the world, it was the end of a man. To the heavens, it was the crowning of a faithful servant. With one last breath, Timothy fell to the ground, his mission complete, his life sealed as an eternal testimony of the truth he had preached. The crowd, intoxicated by blood and vengeance, slowly quieted. Timothy's lifeless body lay on the cold stones, a brutal contrast between the violence of men and the peace that marked his expression. Some retreated, as if an invisible weight had fallen upon them. Others, filled with fanaticism, still raised their fists, celebrating the death of the one they called enemy. But in the alleys, in the hidden houses, among the faithful who had witnessed everything from afar, tears were shed, prayers whispered. The Christians of Ephesus knew they had lost a leader, a brother, a father in the faith, but they also knew that his death would not be the end. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and Timothy, even in death, would live on in the heart of the faith he had defended until his last breath. Under the darkness of the night, when the persecutors had dispersed and the city returned to its indifferent routine, trembling and silent hands gathered Timothy's body. The brothers, those he had taught and guided, would not allow their leader to be left as a forgotten criminal. With contained tears and murmured prayers, they took him to a safe place, away from the eyes of the wicked. There were no public processions, no grand ceremonies, just a small group of faithful, marked by sorrow, but also by the conviction that Timothy had not died in vain. They buried him with reverence, as if planting a seed that would one day bloom. The soil of Ephesus, which had once witnessed his teaching, now held his body, but his voice, his example, would never be buried. The impact of his death spread like waves on a turbulent sea. To the Christians of Ephesus, his absence was an open wound, but also a call to perseverance. The man who had fought heresies, strengthened the brethren, and faced the fury of idolaters had fallen, but his work would continue. The disciples he had instructed took his place, carrying forward the truth he had taught. Paul's words about him were remembered in every secret. Meeting in every service held at the risk of persecution, Timothy, true son in the faith. His life had become a living testimony that the gospel was worthy of any sacrifice, and so even in death, Timothy still preached. In the years that followed, Timothy's name was remembered among the leaders of the early church as one of the faithful who did not back down in the face of persecution. John, the last of the apostles, who still lived and guided the church in Asia Minor, heard of his death and mourned the loss of such a dedicated servant. Those who had walked with Paul before his execution in Rome knew how much Timothy was esteemed by the apostle, how much his faithfulness had been tested in every city, in every trial. His story was told among the faithful as a testimony of courage and zeal, an example for those facing the same sufferings. The gospel continued to spread, but the price paid by its preachers became ever more evident. Timothy now joined that select group of martyrs whose names echoed in every church, strengthening the weary, inspiring the fearful. But his legacy did not end with his generation. Paul's letters to him survived the ages, preserved as testimonies of the relationship between a master and his disciple, between a spiritual father and his son in the faith. In every line, in every exhortation and counsel, one could see God's hand shaping a young man for a work that would outlast his own life. Pastors, bishops, and persecuted Christians in the centuries to come would read these words and find strength to carry on. The call to preach the word in season and out of season still resounded, not just as advice to Timothy, but as a command to all who would come after him. His name, written on the pages of sacred history, would never be forgotten. The years passed, empires changed, and the persecutors who raised their hands against Timothy became dust. But the faith he kept remained alive. The church in Ephesus withstood, strengthened by the example of its fallen leader, and new men and women arose to continue the work. Timothy's name was not forgotten, for his life became part of the foundation upon which the church grew. From city to city, from generation to generation, his story was told to inspire those who needed courage in the face of persecution. The torch of faith, which he had held to the end, was passed on, igniting new flames in hearts that never knew him personally, but lived under the influence of his testimony. His sacrifice placed him alongside the apostles, the prophets, the men and women who gave their lives so that the gospel would reach the ends of the earth. Just as Paul before him, just as Peter, just as Stephen, Timothy joined the cloud of witnesses who followed the Lamb to the very last moment. He did not seek glory, he did not pursue riches, but gave himself completely to the cause of the kingdom. His death was not the end, but a milestone that sealed the truth he had proclaimed. His voice, even silenced by men, never ceased speaking. For those who die for Christ do not disappear. They become seeds that sprout in history, roots that sustain the faith of those who will come after them. And so, the name of Timothy crossed the centuries. His tomb, lost among the mysteries of time, does not carry his true heritage. For his legacy is not bound to the earth, but to the hearts that received the same message he once carried. His steps still echo where the gospel is proclaimed, and his courage is still felt where there is persecution. The story of men may fail to record every detail, but heaven does not forget. For before the throne of the Most High, the blood of the martyrs cries out, and the voice of Timothy remains immortal among those who gave everything for the one who promised them eternal life.